Okay, well, there we have it. 10:34 it is. We still only have 60 or so participants, attendees. We did have 120 plus registrants, so I do expect that number to rise. But given our timing, I'd like to get started pronto here. Good morning and welcome to PDActive's second online speaker forum webinar. My name is Todd Morrish and I will be your host this morning. I'm on the board of PDActive and I currently chair the events committee. We also have, you'll be seeing on your screen, Mary Hahn, who is helping me on the events committee. So we certainly at PDActive miss seeing our friends in person, but we do hope you're all staying safe and healthy and active and socially engaged. It's a lot to think about, but those are some of the ways we get through this journey together. Before I introduce our speaker this morning, Dr. Presti, a little bit of housekeeping. So sorry, Dr. Presti, give me a moment and we'll get through this and get to your meaningful, important, and interesting stuff in a second. First, speaking about socially engaged and active and healthy and all those things, a shameless plug here for our PDActive programs. You may know about PDActive support groups, but did you know that PDActive also offers many other classes and programs for people with Parkinson's? There's Tai Chi and yoga and Pilates and meditation, several of which I've taken and I really love. And there's voice and singing and boxing and dance. PDActive has embraced this new model of digital program delivery, and we have made it easy for our members to access these great classes safely. And they're really quite affordable. We are hoping to get more participants into these programs to continue to make it worthwhile for our instructors. So please do check out our calendar link in the upper right-hand corner of our pdactive.org homepage and spread the word. And now on to the event. Right now, you are all on mute. Please don't be offended. That's just the easiest way to do this so that we can have a fluid presentation without a lot of distractions. Additionally, you will not see other attendees in your Zoom window, only Dr. Presti and myself and Mary. Dr. Presti encourages attendees to submit questions when you have them through the course of his presentation. You may do this by using the question feature in your Zoom screen. There's a toolbar at the bottom of your Zoom screen that has the Q&A tool there. So use that. Mary and I will be monitoring as those come across our screens and pose them to Dr. Presti so that he might be able to answer them in the context of his presentation. We do plan to reserve some time at the end of the presentation for more Q&A, so do keep those questions coming. Additionally, I will present you with occasional poll questions on your Zoom screens related to the content Dr. Presti is presenting. Please answer these as quickly as you can so the doctor can see the results of these polls and speak to them in his presentation. They're really quite simple, and they'll be up on your screen for less than a minute, and they're short reads and quick answers. Very importantly, this webinar will be recorded. Dr. Presti has graciously allowed us to do so, and we will make a copy of Dr. Presti's presentation available on the pdactive.org website and or our YouTube channel in the next few days. So keep your eyes open there. If for any reason Dr. Presti or I get disconnected from this webinar, which I doubt, please be patient and do not disconnect or leave the meeting for a few minutes as we try to get reconnected. It is possible that Mary may take over as a host if I am disconnected. I hope that all makes sense. Finally, and maybe most importantly, PDActive depends on donations to bring programs like this to our members free of charge. And we remain grateful for your contributions. If you have not yet had a chance to make the suggested registration donation of $10 for this webinar, I will paste the link in the chat feature now. Give me 1 second while I do just that. And magically, I just sent a chat to all, well, I sent it to all panelists, so that was a mistake. Hang on a second. I'm going to send it to all panelists and all attendees. It's the same one you've used in months and years past, but there it is. So now, without further delay, PDActive is pleased to introduce to you Dr. David E. Presti. As you no doubt saw from the webinar invitation, his medical qualifications are both lengthy and impressive. Dr. Presti is a neurobiologist and psychologist at the University of California, Berkeley, in the Department of Molecular and Cell Biology, where he has taught since 1991. He also has extensive experience in and done deep research on the therapeutic characteristics of cannabis. Dr. Presti, first, I give you a hearty Go Bears, and welcome and thank you in advance for taking the time to speak to our community today.
Thank you.
So I'll hand the figurative mic over to you now, and please feel free to either expand on that intro, which was very brief, or just dive into your presentation. And then Mary and I will lob in any questions we get from the attendees, and have at it. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. And thank you. Thank you, Todd. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, everyone out there in virtual land listening now or in the future. It really is a delight and a pleasure for me to be here and contribute to the activities of PD Active. And hearing more from what Todd just said about all the things that are available. Wow, what an incredible resource to have in our community here. And I hope that this is a model for PD communities around the world to really make available activities and modalities that we know, have powerful therapeutic efficacy. So thank you for the opportunity to contribute to this project. So as Todd said, I teach at UC Berkeley, where I've taught for 30 years now in neurobiology and psychology. And my interest really is my real deep interest really is the nature of the mind and who we are as conscious beings and how that connects with the rest of what we call physical reality. One aspect of that is what's going on in our bodies and nervous systems and brains and how we can make sense of that from what we know from biology and chemistry and physics. And one aspect of that is the effects of various kinds of medicinal plants and molecules, chemicals, on our physiology and on our psyche. Hence my capacity to kind of speak to this subject here. The way I initially got invited actually was last year. I gave 2 lectures. I mean, I don't do a lot of outside talking except through my classes at UC Berkeley. And like, for example, what I'm doing this morning here at PD Active is the first time I've done anything online since the pandemic, other than my classes at UC Berkeley. So I'm really, it's really delightful to be here. But in 2019, I gave 2 lectures. One was at the Chabot Space and Science Center called The Botanical Genius of Cannabis. And I think someone from PD Active was in the audience and heard that. And then that's how the invitation to come and share with you today evolved. I gave another lecture at the Anthropology Museum as part of an exhibition on psychoactives, on mind-altering substances last fall. And that one was very kind of provocatively titled "Cannabis Neurobiology More Complex Than Black Hole Astrophysics," and really, that is accurate to some extent, to a large extent. But I really could have replaced cannabis neurobiology with just about anything from biology, because living systems are extraordinarily complex, as are physical systems. But we have very relatively simple ways of kind of organizing physical phenomena into grand theories that encompass a lot of stuff. And black hole astrophysics is an example of that, how we can make sense of the observational qualities of black holes from astronomy through these beautiful mathematical framework of Einsteinian general relativity, which is at its core a very simple mathematical framework. And there just isn't anything like that in biology. Biology is very complex and messy, by comparison. So I want to make several points in the next few minutes in what I say, and here they are, and we'll keep coming back to them. First of all, cannabis is a gorgeous plant. Cannabis has a long history of domestic relationship with humanity. Cannabis chemistry and neurobiology are stunning. Cannabis clinical science remains minimal and is poorly supported. And your best source of information regarding cannabis as a medicine is likely to be one another. So if you're expecting me to tell you the answer to how cannabis might be effective in the relief of symptoms of Parkinson's, I'm not going to do that because it's not known, and it's not likely to be known anytime soon. However, there's a lot that can be said that is of relevance. So, and that's where we'll be going. So, cannabis is a gorgeous plant. It's a beautiful plant. It's just all plants really are gorgeous, but you know, cannabis has a particular kind of gorgeosity to it, both its physical form, its aromatic properties, and then of course its complex constellation of medicinal and other sorts of effects. You know, the flowers of the cannabis plant or the buds are the places where the plant concentrates most of the physiologically active essence that it produces. And that's even further, if you look more microscopically at the structure of these buds, you see all these little structures that are called trichromes that are the repositories of the oily secretions that actually contain the physiologically active chemistry. So cannabis goes by many different names in our culture. Marijuana, spelled two different ways, pot, grass, wheat, ganja, bhang, hash, and so forth. I prefer cannabis, the botanical name cannabis, to any of these. The name that's used perhaps very commonly in the United States, marijuana, was actually an adaptation of a Mexican slang word for cannabis that was being used in the 1920s and 30s, and then it was amplified by law enforcement and by the media in the 1930s as part of a campaign to demonize cannabis by associating it with marginalized groups of Mexican Americans. That was one of the things that actually led to its eventual complete illegality in the United States. So that particular word has that additional kind of context attached to it. But cannabis is a great word to use to describe this plant. It comes from this plant family called the Cannabaceae, which is a relatively small family as plant families go. It only has 11 genuses or genera, about 170 different species. And the most widely known of the additional species in the cannabis family or the Cannabaceae family is hops. You know, this is the bitter flavor component of beer that's widely used in beer brewing. It's actually a cousin of cannabis, even though it has a very different chemistry. And then there's a tree, which is not so widely known, called Celtis, which also contains a number of different species. This is to be compared with much larger plant families like the poppy family, the Papaveraceae, which has 44 different genera and 770 or more different species in it, including the California poppy on the right and the opium poppy. And an even larger family, the Solanaceae, which contains almost 100 different genuses and 2,700 or more different species, and that includes all the solanaceous food plants that we eat, like tomatoes and eggplants and potatoes and chilies. It includes flowering plants like Brugmansia, the angel trumpet, which is a very powerful hallucinogenic plant. It includes tobacco, so a lot of different diverse plants that all of which have different kinds of chemistry associated with them. So returning to cannabis again, the question of how many species there is one that botanists still debate. And we hear about Cannabis sativa and Cannabis indica. Sometimes you hear the term Cannabis rudularis, which is a shrubby, a low shrubby variety that comes from Central Asia. But cannabis has been in domestic relationship for humans for so many thousands of years that the question of whether there are multiple species versus just a bunch of different varieties of one species is a really legitimate question. It's like there certainly are lots of different varieties, and there may even be two kind of dominant different kinds of varieties, what's called sativa and indica, but they can certainly interbreed with each other and would do so under natural conditions. So one of the kind of original definitions of a species is that they don't do that. They don't do that sort of interbreeding. So it's kind of like dogs. You know, dogs, there are so many different varieties of dogs. They all look many of them look very different from one another, but they're all the same species of animal that have had a lot of different varieties produced by thousands of years of domestic tuning by humans. And so that brings us to this notion that cannabis has had a long history of domestic relationship with humanity. It's believed to have originated in Central Asia, you know, what would now be Afghanistan or Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, that area of Central Asia, and then has spread to every continent on the planet as part of human migrations. Wherever humans have gone, they've taken cannabis with them. Or cannabis has attached itself. Another way to think of it is that cannabis has attached itself to human migration and moved around with the humans. And so there have been traces of cannabis found in forms of fiber that date back nearly 10,000 years ago in Central Asia. So why has there been this long and rich relationship of cannabis with humanity? Well, it has a number of different medicinal effects to it, which are listed here: analgesic, pain relief, anti-inflammatory, muscle relaxant effects. It stimulates the appetite. It's an antiemetic, reduces nausea and vomiting. It reduces the pressure in the eyeball, intraocular pressure, which can be associated with glaucoma. It has anti-seizure activities. It's a sedative or a relaxant. It's a hypnotic under some conditions that it can promote falling asleep. It's an aphrodisiac. And it produces a psychedelic-like mental state. And by psychedelic-like mental state, I mean it amplifies what's going on in the mind, emotions, thoughts, even awareness. And of course, there's lots of individual difference to how people respond to these different things. And there's also lots of varieties, strain variations in cannabis. So some varieties are going to be more psychedelic than other varieties. Some will be more muscle relaxing than others, and so forth. In addition to those physiological effects, there's also fiber and cloth and paper. There's the fiber properties of the cannabis stem that make it very useful for making materials and paper and cloth from and rope. And this has been perhaps one of the oldest of the uses of cannabis in human societies. And then it also has nutritious properties. The seeds, in particular, and the oil are rich with what are called essential fatty acids that are actually important for the human diet.
Dr. Presti, to interrupt for just a moment, you'll see that I did throw up a poll, which is sort of an early stage poll getting to feel out how many of our members have at least experimented with cannabis treatment for PD specifically. So you get a little sense of what the audience is made up of. Over half of them have not tried it yet, as you see there. Several have tried CBD. One brave soul has tried THC for PD, and quite a few have tried both. So that gives you an idea of what the audience's experience level is. And then I've got a few others popping up here in a few minutes to speak more to the experiences that those that have tried it have felt. So carry on.
Thank you, Todd. That's really good to know. I mean, and again, I'm actually delighted to be able to share this information with so many of you that have not investigated this yet. Just so you, if you ever do choose to investigate these things in the future, you can do it in a much more informed way.
Yes,
So
exactly.
that's a very, yeah, thank you. That was a great idea to ask those questions, Todd. So the medicinal use of cannabis has been documented for thousands of years in human writings, almost as far back as any kind of recorded history goes. One can find references to the cannabis plant described in various different ways. This was a find of about 15 years ago now, where a grave was uncovered in far western China that was believed to be a shaman, that is a medicine person of 2,700 years ago. The body was interred very ritualistically with lots of implements and so forth. And among those things that were buried with this person was a leather pouch that had plant materials in it, and they had been well preserved enough in that dry environment of the Western China deserts that they were able to analyze the botanical properties of this plant material and identify some of it as cannabis. So that suggested that the folks back then were familiar with its medicinal, psychoactive kinds of properties. It's talked about in the Vedas, the ancient scriptures of pre-Hindu India. I like this mosaic here from a cathedral in Sicily that sure looks like it has a cannabis leaf in it, and it's associated with Christ performing some healing here. So there's this kind of association with a kind of medicinal quality to it. Very interesting. So there are all these medicinal effects. In addition to that, one of the things I always emphasize in my teaching about drugs is that everything is pharmakon. And pharmakon is an ancient Greek word that is the root for our terms pharmaceutical, pharmacology, pharmacy, all these things. And pharmakon means medicine and poison at the same time. It's a really important, profound concept that we often forget. So there's always, potential poison qualities to anything that may also be a medicine. And for cannabis, some of the poison qualities are things like it may induce anxiety and panic. It certainly can impair memory. People don't usually consume cannabis in order to improve their memory, just like they wouldn't consume alcohol to improve memory. It's usually has a short-term impairment on memory and judgment, but that reverses, and with when the intoxication wears off. It can even catalyze something like a psychosis, especially in people who are perhaps for reasons that we don't understand, genetically or developmentally inclined to develop a psychotic condition, but that's unusual. And addiction is also a problem in the same way it can be for alcohol. I mean, most people use cannabis without getting into an addiction problem. Most people use alcohol without getting into an addiction problem, but a substantial percentage do, especially of younger folks for cannabis. And there's another aspect of this, which is this history of extreme demonization of this plant. So it's really important to appreciate that everything, that much of what we hear about cannabis these days, even with the increasing acceptance of it, is still being filtered through this long history of demonization, really irrational demonization. For example, despite the legal availability of cannabis in many places in the United States, it remains what's called a Schedule I controlled substance in federal law. That is, at the level of the Washington, D.C. federal government, it is still illegal, completely illegal. And cannabis arrests in the United States, although they have gone down a bit in the last several years, are still more than 500,000 people per year, or 500,000 arrests per year for cannabis. And more people were arrested in 2018 for cannabis possession than for all violent crime combined. Murder, rape, aggravated risk. I mean, this is absurd. And these folks who are arrested, most of them, very few of them are actually going to jail, but they have to go through the whole court system, and it's a big mess and a very expensive process. And really, cannabis has been the fuel and justification for the longstanding war on drugs since the beginning, since Nixon first declared war on drugs in the early 1970s, holding up a package of cannabis in his hand when he did that. It has provided the rationale for the huge amounts of money that have been really squandered on this war on drugs to no avail. None of the other drugs were used by enough people to actually justify, the amounts of money that have been spent over the decades. So here's where we are now in the United States, with 11 states plus the District of Columbia having completely legalized cannabis for all uses, including California and all of the West Coast states, Washington, Oregon, and Alaska. All but 3 states, Idaho, South Dakota, and Nebraska, have some legal availability of medicinal cannabis, either total legalization like 11 states or some legal availability of medicinal cannabis. So even despite this, overwhelming support for at least having cannabis available medicinally, it's still illegal at the federal level, which is, of course, another just a bizarre aspect of our whole justice system. So I think this demonization also goes back to, it's not just, although it has been taken to a new level in 20th century America, it really goes back further than that. One of the historical regions where cannabis was most prevalent and had been investigated for its medicinal properties was India. And of course, the British dominated India for several centuries, beginning in the 1600s and up through 1947. And as part of this, they had a whole commission to study cannabis, called the Indian Hemp Drugs Commission in the 1890s. And they produced a big report where they spoke to all the medicinal effects and so forth. But at the same time, I think it was always considered a little problematic, a little sketchy from the perspective of the British, that this plant came from this place, India, the exotic, crazy India in the eyes of the British. And so the idea that it should be illegal or something like that caught on very early on. For example, I was in Jerusalem a couple of years ago, looking through a museum there, and I saw this notice posted, and it was a notice from 1919 when the British had control of that region, of the Palestinian region of the Middle East following World War I, and the European powers that had dominated, had been victorious in World War I, were in the process of chopping up the Middle East to create all the mess that we have now, really. But in this public notice, here's a little thing about cannabis. Here they're calling it hashish, but they're talking about this is forbidden and it will be seized and people will be arrested and so forth. And this is 1919, before there were any cannabis laws in the United States. The British are declaring it illegal in the Middle East. So this weird demonization as part of the domestic relationship with humanity. So what about the next piece here? Cannabis chemistry and neurobiology are stunning. Well, if we look at the opium poppy, a extraordinary thing happened a bit over 200 years ago, in that there was a single chemical substance called morphine, which was identified from the opium poppy by a young pharmacist assistant in Germany, Wilhelm Friedrich Serturner, and then Serturner purified this chemical component from the opium poppy and then demonstrated by ingesting it himself and testing it on a few friends of his, that it had substantially the same properties, only in a much more concentrated form as the opium poppy. And this was an amazing thing, because the idea that you could take a medicinal plant like opium and then reduce it to a single molecule was a completely new idea. Nobody had thought that, what medicinal plants did was kind of magic. It was beyond the capacity to kind of reduce that to a single chemical. So that was an amazing thing. I call it the profound reduction. And then that has further been associated with particular kinds of neurotransmitter systems in the human body. In the case of morphine, it would be the endorphin system, and that was discovered in the 1970s. So that the discovery of morphine from opium then gave rise to a program where chemists, largely in Germany, were successful in isolating single molecules from a number of different kinds of known medicinal plants and associating their properties with the property of the plant or the fungus with a single chemical. But what about cannabis? Where does it fit in? By the end of the 19th century, nothing was known about cannabis despite its widespread use. And actually by the mid 20th century, nothing was known about cannabis despite its widespread use in terms of its chemistry. The effects of its chemistry. It then began to be appreciated that cannabis has this very unique chemistry, known nowhere else in the plant world. It contains a number of very interesting molecules called cannabinoids, perhaps as many as 80 different kinds of cannabinoids, and that these things can be interconverted. Like, for example, one of the dominant cannabinoids in the cannabis plant is the delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinolic acid, which upon heating or aging or drying will convert to what we call delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC, and similarly for a carboxylic acid form of CBD, which then converts to CBD. So we often hear about cannabis as being dominated by these two molecules here, THC and CBD, and that is true. They're quite prevalent, but they are only two among dozens of different kinds of cannabinoids that are in the cannabis plant. Here are some of the other predominant ones. And you can see they all share something similar in the way they look chemically, for those of you that are familiar with looking at these kinds of chemical structures. It wasn't until 1964 that an Israeli chemist by the name of Raphael Mechoulam discovered that THC was the primary psychoactive chemical in the cannabis plant. That is, that just like morphine was the primary psychoactive chemical in the opium poppy, this molecule was the primary psychoactive chemical in cannabis. Mechoulam at the time was really the only person working, he and his collaborators, working on cannabis chemistry. He also identified cannabidiol, CBD, in terms of its structure, and began to study its properties. And he's still very active. He's 90 years old now. Here he was in the 60s and the 80s and in 2016. And here he was in 2018 when I visited him. I'd always wanted to visit him. So there he is there, me and my wife and my friend, Asha Cohen, who's the reason I got to visit him, because Raphael Mechoulam is a professor at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And Asher is the president of the university, and he and I were friends from graduate school. So that was a great honor. And Mechoulam, actually, his life and work have been documented in this really excellent movie, which I highly recommend. You can watch it free on YouTube. It's a bit over an hour long. And it just shows the kind of amazing work that this guy has done over the decades. He was for many years really the only person who believed that cannabis was a valuable thing to study medicinally. And he created a whole sort of new field.
Welcome to ABC News.
Of biology to study it. How we doing, everyone? Everything okay?
Sorry, David, that was me. But I have a good question here that I might lob out right now. You may be getting deeper into the delta between CBD and THC in a couple slides here, but since you started to touch on it, let me read you Christie's question. Do all of the medical or do all of the medicinal properties besides the psychedelic effects occur in the full spectrum of CBD oil, or does the THC have some additional properties besides the psychedelic properties not found in the CBD oil? If you're coming across that in a few minutes, then I'll table it and ask it again then.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the short answer is that that both the THC and the CBD are important. But we'll get, hopefully more information will come soon on that. One more thing on Meshulam in the movie, though, if you watch it, is, I mean, he's just so, he's so cute when he's describing how he first investigated in humans the psychoactive effects of THC. He first identified its psychoactivity in animal studies. And then he said, well, I need to test this in humans, and nobody had ever done that. So he purified THC from cannabis. He took it home, he gave it to his wife, and he said, make a cake and make 2 cakes and put THC in one cake and no THC in the other cake. And then we'll invite our friends to come over and we can cut up the cakes and we can pass them around, you know, and tell people they're part of an experiment here. And then we'll see what happens. And so he describes that thing about how some people, you know, just got really, you know, stoned, and others experienced no effect at all. And then that's how he established the human psychoactivity of THC. So, which allows me to just mention the different routes of entry into the body that cannabis has. It can be consumed orally, that is eaten, and then it goes through the digestive system, the so-called edibles. It can be inhaled as smoke or vapor from burning of the cannabis or vaporizing it. And then it can be also as a topical application as a salve or something like that. Historically, the ways it was used were were oral digestion and topical application. The smoking or the inhalation is a relatively new thing, because as far as we know from anthropologic and archaeologic research, nobody in the world was smoking anything except the Native Americans smoking tobacco. And then when the Europeans came over and discovered Native Americans smoking tobacco and took that process back to Europe with them, tobacco smoking spread all over the planet. Everybody connected very strongly with tobacco smoking. And then they applied the technologies that were used for tobacco smoking, namely pipes and later cigarettes, to smoking other things. But there's no evidence prior to the introduction of tobacco smoking via Europeans that anyone else in the world was smoking opium or cannabis or other kinds of plant materials prior to their learning about tobacco use. So inhalation or smoking is a relatively new thing. I mean, by that, I mean last few hundred years. But of relevance to folks these days is what are called the pharmacokinetics of smoking versus eating. And that is, if one smokes something, the level of the psychoactive materials, here the THC, in the body goes up very quickly within minutes here, peaks, and then starts coming down again. And so this is minutes. So after smoking, within 10 minutes, one is peaking in terms of what kinds of effects they're going to have. So it becomes relatively easy to sort of titrate how high one wants to be, so to speak, as compared to the ingesting, oral digestive or ingesting of something. Note here that the time scale is hours, not minutes now, like before. This is hours. So if somebody eats some THC, it takes several hours to peak. Here's the THC graph here. These are metabolites here. So this is 5 hours. Now it may have peaked before then and come down by then, which I suspect happened. But we're talking about how it could take hours. And this is the famous edible overdose, where everybody has a story of hearing about someone who ate some kind of cannabis edible, a cookie or a chocolate or something like that. And 30 minutes later, an hour later, they don't feel anything. So they eat another one, or maybe two more, just to make sure. And then 5 hours later or 4 hours later, they are higher than they've ever wanted to be. Now you're not in a, cannabis is not going to kill somebody from an overdose. It's not life-threatening in the way that opioids and even alcohol, sedative hypnotics, almost any other drug would be, but it can be very disconcerting and anxiety-producing for someone to find themselves in that position when they weren't expecting it. So hence the care that needs to be taken with edibles. You have to make sure you give them plenty of time, hours, to examine whatever the effects are. So what can we say about cannabis in the brain and body? Remember that there are these various different cannabinoids in there. And there's this, there was a belief, based on what we knew about other kinds of drugs and how they impacted the nervous system, that there must be receptors somewhere in the nervous system, in the brain, and perhaps elsewhere in the body, that would respond to the THC, a receptor being a protein that's on the surface of a nerve cell, that when a neurotransmitter binds to that receptor, it allows a signal to be sent from one cell to another. Various drugs will exert at least part of their impact on our physiology by substituting for that neurotransmitter and binding to the receptor and promoting some kind of change in the signaling of the brain. And that kind of process had been identified for many different kinds of things: amphetamine, morphine, nicotine, alcohol, and so forth. So what about THC, or what about the psychoactive components of cannabis, THC being the primary one? That remained a mystery until around 1990, when a specific new kind of neurotransmitter receptor was discovered, that to be found throughout the brain. Actually, it turns out to be the most abundant of a particular kind of receptor in the human brain that responds to cannabis, and those are to THC. Those are called cannabinoid receptors. There are now two different types that have been identified. It's called CB1 and CB2. And not only are they found in the brain, they're found throughout the body, all over the nervous system, and all the connections of the brain with the entire body. It's full of cannabinoid receptors, and also in other components of the body physiology, the endocrine system, the immune system. It's within the liver and within the reproductive system. So it's literally everywhere. The kinds of, that is the protein receptor that responds to THC is found everywhere in the body. So that's particularly relevant to all of the claims of various kinds of medicinal effects, because the target molecule for what THC and other cannabinoids is acting upon is so pervasive in the body, it would be likely that there would be a diversity of different kinds of effects that cannabis could have.
Boy, that's interesting. So that means that there's so many more receptors throughout the body that could take in a cannabinoid product, that it's not, I mean, the common perception out there is just smoking it, getting it in your lungs to get it into your bloodstream, or eating it to getting it into your stomach to getting it into your bloodstream are the only two paths. But really, this opens up the door for what, the topicals and the tinctures much more than people might have thought, doesn't it?
It sure does. And it suggests that whatever the endogenous system is, that, I mean, the reason we have this pervasive collection of cannabinoid receptors, presumably it's not there to respond to the cannabis plant. It's there to respond to signaling which is going on within our body in the absence of the plant. That's called the endocannabinoid, the system of cannabinoid connections that are within our body, endo, and that whatever this system is, it's involved in the regulation of a great many things, most of which we don't know much about at all yet. Once that was appreciated, it was, of course, immediately wondered, like, well, if somebody hasn't ingested cannabis or smoked cannabis, they don't have any THC or CBD or these things coming into their body. What is this system doing? What's it responding to? You know, what is the neurotransmitter, the neural signaling molecule that would be the normal activator of this system? And so folks started looking for that, just a small number of folks. And then one was discovered, this molecule here called arachidinyl ethanolamide, also known as anandamide. It was discovered by Raphael Mechoulam and a postdoc of his, William Devane, and in the early 1990s. And then since then, another molecule, 2-arachidinyl glycerol, or 2-AG, has also been identified as a internal signaling molecule, and there may be others as well. It's given rise to two different categories now. People talk about these being endocannabinoids, cannabinoid signaling molecules that are found within our body, and the delta-9 THC and CBD things being phytocannabinoids, you know, found from plants. So we now have this reduction, the complex cannabis plant, to one or two different molecules, and then in association with this system of endocannabinoids. And I have to say that, you know, all of this work was really pioneered, and a lot of it actually done in the laboratories of Raphael Mechoulam and Alan Howlett, who's a professor in the United States, and William Devane, who was a graduate student with Howlett and then went on to be a postdoc with Mechoulam. And I've long thought that there should be a Nobel Prize. You know, we've just had Nobel Prize time here in October, just this year. Very cool that actually two of those Nobel Prizes went to folks affiliated with UC Berkeley. You know, one person in my department, Jennifer Doudna, for CRISPR. But Mechoulam really single-handedly created this entire field of cannabis neurobiology, and Alan Howlett was the first person to really appreciate and identify the cannabinoid receptor. So I hope that the Nobel Prize Committee gives those, Mechoulam and Howlett, the Nobel Prize. William Devane, unfortunately, died 2 years ago. But while Mechoulam is still around, he's 90 years old. So hurry up, Nobel Prize people. So where are we at now? Oh, one more thing about the nervous system that's relevant to the stunning neurobiology here. If we look at and there's a lot of complexity in this cartoon, so we won't worry about it, but briefly speaking, when neurons, this is one neuron connecting to another neuron, there's a release of neurotransmitter. The neurotransmitter sticks to receptor proteins. In the case of the endocannabinoid receptors are found here on the axon terminal, and they are recipients of something which is called a retrograde signal. So the reason I'm mentioning this is it's another really cool and different aspect of endocannabinoid neurobiology, in that the signaling is retrograde. It comes backward. It goes across from one neuron to the other in the direction opposite from what people thought things always went. And it turns out this backward signaling is pervasive. It's all over the place in our brains and bodies, and has further given rise to whole new areas of research in neurobiology. And then I just want to point this out. The cannabinoid receptors are really complex structures that mediate a lot of different internal cell chemistry and can lead to a lot of different effects with a lot of different properties of amplification. And so the reason I say these things is not to bamboozle you, but to point out that when we talk about the complex effects of something like cannabis, it makes complete sense that you know, here are things that are interacting with such a really sophisticated and nuanced aspect of cell function that it could easily give rise to lots of different kinds of things. Let me say that most of the activity in talking about the medicinal properties of cannabis have focused on THC and CBD, and there are other things going on as well. But in their forms of THC and CBD, we've even had an FDA-approved product called Marinol, which is synthetic THC. It's been legally available since 1986 for its anti-nausea and appetite-enhancing indications. And very recently, just 2 years ago, there has been a legally available form of CBD, but it's only FDA approved for one thing, the treatment of this intractable seizure disorder in very young children. CBD is also known from controlled research to have sedative, hypnotic, and relaxing kinds of effects, and also antipsychotic effects. And remember, there are other cannabinoids there as well that have not been well studied. They all interact with each other. They interconvert. They interact with the cannabinoid receptors in various ways that modulate one another's effects. And in addition to that, something that's more recently been appreciated is there are a bunch of other interesting molecules in the cannabis plant. Plants are never just one or two molecules. There are hundreds of molecules. And in the case of cannabis, among these hundreds of molecules are what are called the terpenes and terpenoids. They account for the aromatic properties of the plant. Cannabis, or THC or CBD, they don't have aroma. What the smell of the plant is due to these molecules here. And these molecules also have medicinal effects, therapeutic effects, which have not been studied by any kind of controlled science except in one or two cases, but have a long lore of herbal medicine kind of knowledge associated with them, because they occur in many different kinds of plants, as well as things that we use for as spices and herbs, and our culinary practices and so forth contain a lot of these things, and so also does the cannabis plant. In addition to that, there's a class of molecules called flavonoids, which are powerful antioxidants. They occur in the cannabis plant, and they're believed to modulate the effects of some of these other things, which gives rise to this notion, also coined by Raphael Mechoulam, of what are called entourage effects. That is, interactions between the cannabinoids and the terpenes and the terpenoids, all sort of modifying the way they all interact. So there are papers that have been written on this more recently. So that brings us to, well, that was the chemistry and neurobiology are stunning. Cannabis clinical science remains minimal and is poorly supported. So, if you start doing searches online with Google Scholar, or look into the National Institutes of Health database on published scientific literature, you'll find a smattering of papers like this, effects of cannabidiol in the treatment of patients with Parkinson's disease, an exploratory double-blind trial. And many of these, this is from 6 years ago now, 2014, many of these kinds of studies, of which there are only a few handfuls really, will say, well, it looks interesting, but we can't say for sure because we need more data. There have been multiple reasons for this, one being that until very recently, it was almost impossible to do any kind of human studies in the United States on cannabis. The federal government, which needs to approve any kind of application for human research, would simply deny it. They did not want any scientific evidence to support medicinal efficacy of cannabis, because it would contradict the program of demonization, which has gone on for nearly a century in the United States. So that's now shifting slowly. So a lot of this research comes from other countries, but it's also poorly funded. It takes money to do research, and there's no financial incentive for a lot of folks to support this kind of research, because you're not going to be able to patent the cannabis plant and make a bunch of money, by a pharmaceutical preparation. But there have been several reviews around, like if you go to the website of the Parkinson's Foundation, there's a relatively recent document where they're giving their summary of medical marijuana. And it basically says the same thing. You know, there are things that look suggestive, but we can't say for sure and so forth. This is a good website. It's called the CBD Project, and it has a really nice, they get scientists to write with some authority on various different topics in a continuous way. And I know the people that run the Project CBD site, and they're really good people. And so this is a really good source of information, and you'll have all these available to you to refer to later.
Dr. Presti, may I jump in for a moment?
You bet.
I just wanted to give you a time check. I promised you a 45-minute time check. It's now closer to 50 plus, so just letting you know that.
Okay.
We have more time on our side. We've scheduled till 12:30, but we do want to leave some time for Q&A. Also, this may be a good spot to inject a quick question by one of our members, since you're talking about cannabis for Parkinson's disease. Michael asks, how is cannabis used for PD? And then a bit of a block and tackling sort of practical question. How do you find a physician that uses it for PD treatment? None of the neurologists we have used have any experience with it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you'd like to speak to that now or sometime later, but I thought I'd offer that to you.
Okay, thank you. I can say something about it in the context of what you're looking at right now on the screen, because this is it was a very short little review from last year, 2019, marijuana for Parkinson's disease, ? And so the summary of this review is just completely typical of just everything out there that we can find these days. Cannabis might have medicinal efficacy in Parkinson's disease. One aspect of that may be neuroprotective effects. So we know that one of the ultimate factors that's important for the development and progression of Parkinson's disease is the loss of the dopamine using neurons in an area of the brain, in the brain stem called the substantia nigra. And as those neurons die, which they're prone to do in everyone, but in folks that develop Parkinsonian symptoms, that dying off happens more quickly. And when the number of neurons gets below a certain level, then one starts feeling those symptoms. And so if there's a way to slow that dying off process, that's called neuroprotection, then that could not only be a factor in preventing the onset of Parkinson's disease, but it would slow the progression of symptoms once one starts to develop symptoms. And that may be one thing that's going on with cannabis. Animal studies show improvement in the movement aspects of Parkinson's, like the bradykinesia, the difficulty initiating movement, and the tremor. But these have not been established by any kind of controlled human trial. But patient surveys indicate many different benefits of Parkinson's, both for the motor symptoms like bradykinesia and tremor, and also the non-motor symptoms that may be related to cognitive function and mood and so forth. So, which really brings us to, I'll skip that. Well, let me say this, because when I was looking around for research that was related to cannabis and Parkinson's disease, another thing I ran across was, remember, one of the established medicinal properties of cannabis is that it's anti-inflammatory. And so many folks are thinking that chronic inflammatory processes, chronic inflammation of various kinds, internal to our body in some way, are actually a major factor in a lot of human illness. And so folks have written about the possible connection between chronic inflammation and Parkinson's. And maybe one of the medicinal effects of cannabis is by addressing the inflammatory process, but another very potent, perhaps even more potent way to address chronic inflammation is through dietary interventions. And there's actually a fair amount of material out there that speaks to the, the consumption of tea and coffee as reducing the risk and reducing the symptom progression in Parkinson's disease, presumably because of some anti-inflammatory components of these beverages. So that's very interesting. And then probably the most effective way to deal with the inflammation from a dietary intervention is to incline more toward a plant-based diet. So vegan or mostly vegan, but that doesn't mean that one shouldn't be eating ever any meat or something, but eat mostly plants. High fiber, fruits and vegetables, these things have anti-inflammatory properties. They're known to improve the health of the gut microbiome, that is all the microorganisms that are living within our digestive system. And some folks are thinking that this microbial universe of our digestive system is really important in the development of Parkinson's disease. So here's another article from a recent article that looks at food-based therapies for Parkinson's. So I highly recommend looking into recommendations for that. And the fact that throughout the digestive system, there are lots of cannabinoid receptors. That may be another place where there's an interaction between the medicinal effects of cannabis and the therapeutic effects on the body. So finally, that brings us to my last point here, that your best source of information reminding about cannabis as a medicine may be one another. Because the science just isn't there yet, and it's going to be a long time coming because the chemistry and neurobiology of cannabis are so complicated. There is just not going to be any simple answer soon. And I'll close by just pointing out an analogous situation that applies to kind of the general field of psychiatric illness. I will invoke the former director of the National Institute of Mental Health, Tom Insel, who was the director of NIMH for 13 years. And so the National Institutes of Mental Health is the component of the National Institutes of Health, of NIH, that is charged with trying to understand mental wellness and mental disease. So things like psychiatric conditions of depression or psychosis or manic depression, and to some extent neurodegenerative diseases like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's and so forth. And after 13 years in that position, here's what he said after he stepped down from that. He said, look, I was 13 years directing NIMH. We really pushed on the neuroscience and genetics of mental disorders. And when I look back on that, I realized that while I think I succeeded at getting lots of really cool papers published by cool scientists at fairly large costs, maybe $20 billion over that time, I don't think we moved the needle at all in reducing suicide, reducing hospitalizations, improving recovery for the tens of millions of people who have mental illness. I hold myself accountable for that. So what he's saying is that whatever the biology and chemistry of mental illness, depression, psychosis, and so forth are, it's so complex that it is so far beyond anything we've been able to do so far that all of this research and trying to understand the brain and how it might be connected to these mental conditions has really not led to anything. And so what he did when he left NIMH, he first worked for Google for a couple of years. And then he co-founded another organization called MindStrong. And what MindStrong does is it just uses data. It's using how people are dealing with things in their life, what's working for them, what isn't, and so forth. And it's collecting all of this via phones, and it's trying to make sense of everything just through the data. And that has been applied by a number of different companies now. I'm not advocating any of these companies. I'm just throwing up three brands of things out there because people are trying to collect information about the medicinal properties of cannabis. And somehow through looking at how a whole millions, perhaps hundreds of thousands or millions of people are responding to things, get some information onto what kinds of things are working and what kinds of things are not working and so forth. And so that's why I say that your best source of information regarding cannabis may be one another, to talk to one another about what's working, pay attention to whatever becomes more available online through organizations perhaps like PD Active and so forth that are looking at surveys. It is, I mean, I hear what the person said around how do you find a doctor that knows about this? That's not easy. You know, the folks who go through regular kind of medical training in neurology and so forth, they learn very little about this in medical school or in their residencies. And so you have to find physicians that are specialized in medicinal cannabis. And fortunately, you know, there are more of those folks showing up, but it takes some asking around to find out, you know, who do you trust, and how do you find a dispensary, a source of medicinal cannabis products that you trust and that you can believe that the recommendations that they're giving will be perhaps helpful to follow up on. So this is the hard work of where we're at right now. I had this one picture here because this is a book that's coming out sometime early next year, The Cannabis Gardener, and it's about growing the plant and kind of getting to know the plant and making tinctures and stuff like that. So if you have any inclination for gardening or botany yourself, I recommend getting to know the plant because it's an amazing plant, and the more that one knows the plant, the more deeply may one be able to cultivate one's relationship with it. Well, I think that's where I wanted to end up. So maybe that's a good the amount of time. Todd, what do you think?
I think that's terrific. That's about 1 hour exactly, plus a few minutes. So we will move to Q&A, and we'll do it in a little bit of a hodgepodge fashion. I have been running some poll questions on the sidelines here as you've been working along in your content. And we have some questions that have come in from folks, a couple of which I've injected and thrown at you. I will refresh on one that Michael asked, which is, his question was, how is cannabis used for PD, which I think we've started to cover. How do you find a physician that uses it for PD treatment in the consumer area, whereas you're in the academic arena? Are there doctors out there specifically trained in and treating for using cannabis for PD, and how would we find them?
Well, it's a good question. You know, I only know one cannabis physician, and he's closing his practice after being the pioneer really in this area for 25 years. He's now approaching the time when he wants to retire himself. But I'll tell you what I can do, Todd. I will ask him and his colleagues if they have recommendations that I can then email you, and then you can make them available. I mean, I don't want to recommend folks that I don't know anything about.
Sure.
That's where my last point here is about talking to one another. So if you have a friend that has seen a doctor that person believes is very knowledgeable about this, then that particular physician might be worth following up with. But let me find out something more, and then I will get back to you as soon as possible on that.
That would be great.
I know someone I can know.
That would be terrific. And I will also take this opportunity to spin it back to the community of 72 participants right now, that if you have used the doctor in the Berkeley, Oakland area that you would recommend, please feel free to either email me directly, toddmorish@gmail.com, or put it into the comments or question or the chat window. So I'll give Michael one more shot here. The same Michael asks, can you discuss cannabis use for nausea? My mom has had PD for several years and has chronic nausea. None of the medications the doctors have prescribed have been effective. They ruled out it being a side effect of medication, but believe it is PD related to poor gut movement. So you did speak to gut
Mhm.
health a minute ago, specifically regarding diet. But is there anything else that cannabis can solve for in the nausea department?
Mhm. Well, cannabis has a long history of documented use for as an anti-nausea medicine. And here it's believed to be primarily the THC that does that. In fact, one of the FDA approved indications for the Marinol, which is the prescription, the expensive, way more expensive than cannabis, prescription form of THC, is as an anti-nausea medicine. And so it has been demonstrated in well-controlled human clinical trials to have impact on nausea. So I would recommend trying some THC preparations, start low, because THC is also the primary psychoactive component. It's the one that makes you high, and maybe you don't want to get high. Maybe you want to just have the anti-nausea effect. And so I, again, would connect with someone you trust, that a colleague that has been to a cannabis dispensary somewhere, of which there are many, and I don't have any recommendations on where to go. Um, to get a sort of low THC tincture or something like that that could be helpful for nausea. My guess is that there would be some benefit experienced if that's something that this person has not tried yet, because it does have a very well established, that's something that has been studied with good clinical science. And the reason it was studied for good good clinical science is that it allowed a company to make a patented preparation and market it for several decades now. So there was a financial incentive to doing those clinical studies. Without the financial incentive, it just is not happening in our society, which is, again, a sad thing, that organizations like the National Institutes of Health are not all about just the basic science, but so much of that is influenced by the needs of the pharmaceutical agenda, and how to make a buck from things eventually, which is also what happened with medical cannabis. As soon as cannabis became legally available in California, what do we see? Billboards everywhere, advertising its availability. We just don't seem to know how to do it, other than
Right.
that now.
Big pot leaves on billboards across the country, and creative, clever names of their dispensaries are rife out there nowadays. So another question, I'll keep pulling these off of the inbound questions here, so this is working great. One of our attendees asks, are there ways of stimulating production of endocannabinoids in the human body? So I guess that means
We don't know.
naturally stimulate those without the use of anything external.
Yeah, we don't know anything about that, and nor would it be. It's very unlikely to not be something as simple as just wanting to stimulate production of endocannabinoids, because whatever the benefits are of medicinal cannabis, it probably has to do with balances of things. You're just tuning the system in various ways. It's not like you're producing more of it, but you're just changing and modulating the effects that are already going on in the endocannabinoid system, which are clearly pervasive. I'm going to turn off the screen share. Is that okay? And then they can see us. You think that would work?
That's okay with me. Yep. If the questions that come in have specific relevance to any of your content, we can reshare later. But
Okay.
let's stay in this mode for now. Let me see. Aaron voices some frustration and says, why hasn't more research been done regarding cannabis and PD? It's been legal in some states for years. How can we create more awareness of options for patients and education?
I don't have the answer to that. I'm completely on board. I think there ought to be way more research around this. As I mentioned, the only reason I know there hasn't been more is that a lot of drug type research gets supported through pharmaceutical money, pharmaceutical company money. And so if there's not a clear way to patent something and make a commercial product out of it, there's a dearth of research in those areas. So that's one. The other is the long history of demonization of cannabis, the fact that it's still largely colored in the eyes of many people by, well, isn't this a dangerous addictive substance? Because why is it illegal at the federal level? And why are so many hundreds of thousands of people still arrested every year? It must be a problem. Well, it's not a problem. It's never been a public health problem. It's always been a completely motivated, politically motivated set of decisions that have led to its illegality and demonization. But I think more advocacy from organizations like Pediactive and the Parkinson's Foundation and are the way forward around this, around getting more research done.
Good. A quick question from Terry. Can we grow it legally in California?
Yes, you can. You don't even have to have you used to have a physician's letter saying that you had a medical use, but since it's been made legally, legal for all recreational purposes as well, recently, 2 years ago. So it's now, I mean, there's a limit to the number of plants you can grow. I don't know what that is, but it's some reasonable number, 6 or something like that. So yes, you can grow it in your own garden. It needs water and sunlight, but otherwise it's pretty tolerant to not needing much else.
Right. It is 6. I can tell you that because I looked it up. I'm growing 2 sativas in my backyard right now, and they're getting close to harvest. So it's actually an enjoyable hobby. And they're now beginning to take over all of the sun requirements for the backyard because they're about 7 feet tall.
Fantastic. Yeah.
So if anybody's looking for sativa in the next month or two, give me a ring.
There you go.
I'd like to share a few polls with you, Doctor, and see if you'd like to comment on them. But some of them have been relevant to your content, and some of them are just curiosity questions that I'd like you to see and speak to. But one of them that's up right now is sharing is, do you feel like you have a reliable resource through which to purchase medical cannabis? And before I throw it to you, I will add another personal anecdote here, and that is that somebody asked about, are there doctors out there that are trained in prescribing cannabis treatments for PD? I don't have one. There used to be one in Walnut Creek. I can't remember her name. Instead, I've used Harborside and a couple of other dispensaries where I go to shop for a topical that I use for a tremor on my forearm where I've generated tendinitis. And I go in there and I basically just find someone that's knowledgeable and I talk to them about my problems. They're so knowledgeable about the chemical reactions of the different products that they have available, and they test them all very thoroughly, that I find them to be, ersatz doctors in a way. So someplace like Harborside or someplace that you've been to and you trust, and you could even find an employee there that you trust and keep going back and asking for them. And explain your new situations, and they'll give you, I use a tincture, for example, for inflammation and general body pains. I use a topical for the tendinitis, as I mentioned. But a good dispensary can be almost as good as a quality doctor. So, but here you see that most folks are worried that they don't have a reliable resource through which to purchase medical cannabis, over 50%. And I'm sorry, they do, but almost half don't. Any comments on that regard?
Well, only to reinforce what you just said, Todd. I think that talking to others and sharing information as you just did, and finding a dispensary and the one that you mentioned, as far as I know, is a good one. These folks are very experienced in having dealt with a lot of buyers over quite a few years now. And know how people they're coming back and they're saying, look, you know, I have Parkinson's, I have a tremor, and I took this product that you recommended and it really worked well. Then they remember that, and they can recommend it to somebody else. And so that's a great way to get information. That's as I keep coming back to, you're one another's best sources at this point. And I don't know whether there's a way that you can compile a database of this and then make it available to people who ask that are part of the pediatric or you know, whatever works for your particular way of sharing information. But there's nothing better than that right now. You're more likely to get good information that way than you are from a random neurologist, because unless the neurologist has taken it upon themselves to get additional experience, knowledge about cannabis, they're not likely to have learned a lot in medical school about it.
Yeah, and one of the benefits of having specific doctors trained in the field was that pre-legality, the doctors were also crutched on for the sake of getting a letter of authorization that you would take to the dispensaries. Since it's become legal, all you need is your ID and at the dispensaries. But you would still think that, especially since it's legal now, that they can prescribe it more freely, and there would be more of them out there. But I've not done the research, so maybe what we'll do is do a little membership survey in the next few weeks and ask questions like, are you using a specific doctor? What dispensary do you like best? And what products are you using for various PD ailments? So perhaps we'll get some more of that data from our member base.
Yeah, I'd be interested in seeing that as well, just for my own education around you know, what your experiences are.
Good, we can share some of that. I put up another poll that I threw up a few minutes ago. In your experience, what has CBD helped you with? So not THC, that's another one coming up here. Of course, many haven't tried it yet, which is understandable. The biggest response is for pain and inflammation reduction. Close second is non-motor symptoms like anxiety, depression, fatigue, etc. And then some even use it for motor symptoms. Does that strike you as about the right blend of what folks are out there using CBD cannabis for?
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't have there's no intrinsic, you know, science-based reason to predict, you know, like what things that would be most effective for, but that makes those sorts of responses to CBD make sense. There's a kind of been an explosion of CBD products of all different kinds, and a lot of them are really sketchy, and you know, pizza sauce with CBD in it and stuff like this. So really, it makes sense to go to a good source, a good dispensary, talk to the practitioners who are there, and get the best, you know, kind of clinically vetted products that are available, rather than just your random stuff that you can buy, you know, just about anywhere these days.
And that's why it's important to be sure you go to a reputable dispensary, because they will take pains in vetting the products that they bring in. So the products at the dispensary are not just their own. Many dispensaries have their own products, but they're also bringing in third-party products. And if they're a good dispensary, they're using certified labs to do the testing of the product that comes in, and making sure that they're safe and you know, ethical. I put up the similar poll and the results of that poll, but this time regarding THC. In your experience, what has THC worked best for? Again, half have not tried it, which is to be expected. And then the biggest response set is under relaxing and to solve for non-motor symptoms like anxiety and pain and inflammation reduction. Does that sound consistent with your experience?
Yeah, and I think I mean, I don't have the CBD results in front of me at the same time as the THC, but there's a lot of similarities there. You know, so we don't really understand, because even if you're using a THC product, it still has CBD in it, and CBD products still have THC in it, and unless you're getting Marinol, pharmaceutical Marinol, it's not
Right.
pure THC. And so there always could be some degree of modulation and entourage effect between the THC and the CBD. So again, it speaks to what works best for you, because there's clearly going to be a lot of individual difference in cannabinoid physiology, and just from one's own history of use, what you're wanting or not wanting, and all of that is going to impact the kinds of effects you have. So it's really important to use the things that work best for you.
Good. And to segue from that, since we were talking about THC and the psycho effects of THC, David asks, being clean and sober, how could I justify using cannabis for PD? And that's more of a personal question. I'm not expecting you to have an answer for that, but I guess my first answer to David would be start by experimenting with CBD, which is not a psychoactive, which does not have a psychoactive element in it, and has some very good medicinal properties, either in tincture or in topical. I mean, you can even smoke CBD, but it's harder to find. But any thoughts there on that before we move along?
Well, I share your respect for sobriety around that. I worked in the addiction treatment business for more than a decade at the VA hospital in San Francisco in the 90s, and so I think that it's important to hold at very high priority, and at the same time not necessarily undermine your capacity to benefit from medicinal effects of various preparations. And so I think, Todd, your statement about CBD, which is not going to have the high producing effects of THC, to use preparations that are enriched in CBD and experiment with small doses to see that if you're getting symptom relief without any alteration of consciousness, and just continue to be really attentive to that, in the same way that recovery programs generally allow or open to the use of all kinds of medications that may have psychoactive effects, as long as one is very cognizant of, like, you're not using this to get high or
Right.
to cope with stresses,
Right.
but to treat particular kinds of symptoms in a very judicious way.
Right. And I'll also add, for David's sake, that if you're worried about specifically the clean and sober element and the ethical pieces around that, then staying away from THC entirely is fine. But if you're worried about getting high, there are alternatives when you blend CBD together with THC. For example, I've used a 1-to-1 THC to CBD topical and tincture that have been helpful. And I'm not feeling, of course, when I rub a topical on my arm doesn't get high. But the added THC in there tends to penetrate a little more deeply than just the CBD. So I'm using THC in my topical. The tincture I use is also a 1-to-1, and you can get varying strengths, right? A 2-to-1 CBD to THC, 3-to-1, 4-to-1, etc. So you can sort of find a sliding scale for yourself that works on the blended options of some of those products. So the flowers are not really blended. The flower is you're either smoking THC or you're smoking CBD. I have not experienced any blending going on there, but so that's another option for those that are sensitive to the sobriety of it all. Most of the polls that I put up, let's see here, hang on a second. Most of the polls that I put up had the option up top of I'm not using CBD or THC. So this particular poll that I'm sharing right now, which I just threw up for folks, speaks to that. If you have not yet tried cannabis for PD treatment, what is holding you back? If you can see those results, Dr. Presti, the biggest response at 60% is lack of information. And the next one logically is questions around research and is it still safe? A few folks were worried about cost, purchase channels unknown, and fear of getting high. So
curiosity points. I don't know if you would like to speak to any of that, but I'm happy to move on to more questions.
Yeah, well, lack of information, hopefully that's beginning to be addressed even by what you're hearing today here, and following up by looking at websites like Project CBD, which would be my top recommendation for just getting more information about the overall field of the medicinals, THC, CBD sorts of things. Medical efficiency, efficacy, not enough research. That's going to continue to be the case for a while. That's why your best source of information is one another. In terms of safety, there are a few things that have the long history of safe use that cannabis has. I mean, thousands of years of documented medicinal use with very low toxicity. People just do not get into trouble normally with cannabis. I mean, they certainly never are life-threatening situations, but the kind of the risk of things like psychosis or something like that is a relatively small number of folks and can be modulated by just using very low doses of things or sticking with CBD as a way to start, which is an antipsychotic, not a pro-psychotic.
Mm-hmm.
And then purchase channels would be, of course, something that you're talking about how to address through the sharing of information. Fearing of getting high, again, you can ameliorate that by just going with CBD and low amounts of THC, at least in the beginning.
Yeah. Good. Well, I think this is at the very least telling us that a lot of folks are very interested in the alternative and are craving more information. So I can see a survey in our future. I'm bouncing around here a little bit because I see a lot of questions coming in. Let's see. Oh, but before I move on, you just made a comment a moment ago, Dr. Presti, about a website. Is that cbdproject.com or .org?
I think it's all projectcbd.org. Yeah, all one word. I mean, if you just, I tend not to remember website names. But if you put Project CBD into a
search box,
CBD project into a search engine, you'll get the website right offhand.
Okay. Oh my gosh, my typing is so terrible. Projectcbd.org. I've put that in the comments for folks. If that's incorrect, then like Dr. Presti says, please do a Google search for similar keywords, and I'm sure you'll find that. I'm behind on questions here. Christina points out that a resource that was recommended to me is Medican, where you can speak to a cannabis doctor. Recommended is Motion Health in Santa Rosa, the first on the list. So I will put that into the group chat also so folks can see that resource. Thank you, Christina. Here we go. Kathy asks, is there any reason to believe that CBD may contribute to tinnitus? That's ringing in the ears for those of you that don't know what that is. I know it all too well. Or cause other negative side effects? Good question.
I've never heard of anything like that, but in fact, here I just Googled it, right? I mean, I said tinnitus and CBD. The first thing that comes up is a website from last year, an article from last year in something called Healthy Hearing, claiming that CBD may help tinnitus. So, but these are just, there's been no research about any of this. And so, you can do the same research that I'm doing and you'll find the same minimal amounts of information that are out there by just using search engines.
Yeah.
So, but I can tell you with assurance, there's no reason to believe that it might cause tinnitus, even though maybe it has some impact. It's just not known.
Yeah, I can tell you I have tinnitus and I have not tried any cannabis specifically for that. I'm certainly not pouring anything into my ears, but if I learn of anything out there, I'll let folks know. But like Dr. Presti said a few slides back, it's frustrating, yes, that there's so little research being done, or at least published to date, for our needs, the PD community's needs. But we are right now probably our best shared resource. So for that reason, I think a survey is going to be well received and very beneficial to the membership of PD Active. So stay tuned on that, everyone out there listening. Let's see if I can catch up here a little bit. Mary, if you see any, please do chime in. I'm behind, so.
I've seen a lot of kind of the same issues raised in groups. I will say one thing about tinnitus is that it's obviously the source of that is hearing loss, but there's also neurosensory degeneration that accompanies Parkinson's and also Alzheimer's, certain forms of Alzheimer's disease. So it's reasonable to say that something that would benefit Parkinson's might also be affected by CBD. I have a question for you, though. What do you know about the relationship between alpha-synuclein and CBD, if anything?
I don't know anything, and I suspect very little is known. I mean, that speaks to perhaps the neuroprotective effects of what have been thought to be neuroprotective effects of cannabis, because we know that alpha-synuclein is involved somehow in the toxic effects on the dopamine producing neurons. But I don't know of anything. I would just have to do put those terms into a search engine and see what kinds of papers might come up, but I'm sure it's minimal.
And hope for the best.
Yes, exactly. It's a good question, though.
Yeah, I haven't seen anything on that. There has been a bunch of work done on pesticides and Parkinson's. In fact, that's one of the more potent risk factors that we've been able to identify up to now.
Yes, that is true. I mean, we do know something about what it promotes, further neurodegenerative processes, and certainly some of the pesticides and fungicides that are widely used in agribusiness have been well established in doing that in both animal studies and human epidemiological studies.
Right.
Again, it speaks to the importance of diet here, go to farmers markets and buy your local organic food instead of the stuff grown by agribusiness that is full of pesticides and herbicides.
Agreed.
A close colleague of mine has recently been involved in the suit against Monsanto. Beate Ritz, she's done a lot of work on pesticides and Parkinson's. It's very challenging.
Yes, it is.
Folks, if you didn't see it, a reminder that I pasted Dr. Machulam's story, the link to that on YouTube, into the chat window. That can also just be searched quite easily on YouTube, as long as you spell his name correctly, Mechoulam. So I'll plan to take a look at that later.
Here's a fun question from Andrea. If there's so little science on cannabis, aren't the dispensaries just blowing smoke?
Well, the dispensaries are using their own data collection. So they're doing the science, so to speak, but they're doing it in a big data kind of way. They're gathering information from lots and lots of people's stories, and then trying to synthesize, if they're doing a good job, they're then trying to synthesize that into the products that they buy and make available, and then how they recommend them to different customers. Because it's not possible to say with any kind of assurance that controlled scientific studies have established, this to be good for that and that to be good for this and so forth, because those just have not been done. So it's not blowing smoke, but it's a different way of collecting data and making it available if they're doing a good job at it.
But it is a fair question, and I think the doctor's point earlier about we being our own best source of information, the dispensaries take that to another level in terms of network data effect. You know, they're getting not just the 10 or 20 people from PD Active coming in asking them questions about PD specific symptoms and which treatments might be best, but they're getting hundreds of thousands of visitors from lots of different circles. So it's the network effect of collection, and it is very frustrating that there's not more medically known out there. But keep in mind, even though cannabis has been used in various forms for thousands of years, as Dr. Presti pointed out, it's only been legal for a handful of years. And so legality has definitely sprung a lot of research in the medical community, but none of, it's still in its infancy, and those kinds of things take years to produce tests and clinical responses and products. So I suspect, I haven't sort of peeled back the covers and asked any doctor friends that might be working on it what the timeline might be, but I do suspect we're going in the right direction in terms of having legalized it and now hopefully getting more medical, very trained professional medical opinions around it soon.
Mm-hmm.
Would you agree, Dr. Presti?
I would. Let me just, I just noticed a question in the Q&A. I'm not reading them, but I just happened to see this one.
Sure, go for it.
Around pesticides in cannabis, because it just builds right off of what we were just talking about, Mary, in response to your comment, and that can be an issue. I mean, cannabis is a plant. People who are growing it, especially in a mass scale, are sometimes not using organic technique, where they're not using chemical enhancements and so forth. Sometimes they are. They're using pesticides, they're using herbicides and so forth. And so again, that speaks to knowing your source and being able to, because the cannabis dispensaries, if they're good, they should know, like, well, this particular set of varieties here has been grown under organic conditions by growers who are really experienced and so forth. And yeah, I think we do have to be concerned about pesticides in some of the cannabis products.
Right.
I see two.
I'm somewhat skeptical. I'll just put this out here. We don't have to talk about it necessarily. I'm a professor of epidemiology at UCSF, and I've done a lot of environmental research, so, and as well as large-scale clinical trials. And I have reservations about unstructured sort of research that doesn't follow what is the accepted norms in terms of designing a study in the correct way and doing sort of a series of over time of research that builds on the biology. It's sort of like in these days we're thinking about Trump and how he had unapproved treatment for his recent COVID experience. And I think that people get enthusiastic about what they're doing because they really believe in it. They think it's a good thing, and most of the time it probably is. But we have to, my view of science is you must be a skeptic first and foremost. And so I would think that the dispensaries are not a clean slate. They are interested in making money on it. They believe in their product, and maybe everything is fine, but it's important to be skeptical. And that's my stance.
I agree. I agree with that. And it is unfortunate that we don't have a more reliable source of public information with good science behind it for such things. And so, but absolutely, I mean, all of these places are businesses, and they may have their inclinations to supporting certain products, and it just speaks to talking to as many people as possible. And if that's the best we can do right now, and we can only hope that at some point there will be a whole division of the National Institutes of Health, which is studying cannabinoid neuroscience and clinical applications in good controlled scientific studies. That would be fantastic if that happens.
All right, I've got a couple others here, Dr. Presti, and I think we're nearing the end of our window, but Karen has two questions, maybe an observation and a question. First, she says, I found it great for bradykinesia, but also seems to cause more dyskinesia. And again, these things will vary from patient to patient, and so that doesn't mean that there's a universal cause and effect for everyone. But does that make sense to you, Dr. Presti? Any feedback there?
It could easily make sense. I don't know. I mean, there's no detailed scientific understanding of how the cannabinoids are interacting with the nervous system to produce these different kinds of effects. I completely agree. There's a lot of individual difference and a lot of possibility for
Sure.
the combination of things.
Sure. Her second one is a fair question from us uninitiated in the medical world. Are we safe mixing PD meds and CBD?
As far as is known, yes, there wouldn't be any negative interactions there. But again, not much is known.
Okay.
But I agree. I also advocate doing it's so easy now to do a search online. All you need to do is put in CBD, whatever the medication is that you're concerned about, the Parkinsonian medication, drug interaction, interaction, and you'll get immediately any information that's known about an interaction there. I mean, that's how physicians do it these days. If they're presented with a question like you just asked, of like how to discern whether there's an interaction between two things that they should be aware of, they'll just put it into a search engine and see whether there's been anything written about it.
Mm-hmm. Good. Folks that are still with us, and there are still 58 participants, do feel free to scan through the chat window, which I'm doing here because folks are leaving some interesting feedback that aren't necessarily questions for the doctor, but and also some resources. So scan through that. Somebody exclaimed, "Herbicide is the best!" exclamation point. So we will keep this topic alive in our community. Let me see if there are any other questions here. Mary, if you're seeing anything, chime in, but I'm
There's
getting...
a very long one that just came in.
Regarding CBD/THC versus synuclein. Protein tangles. Have not seen marijuana research on this, but there are some promising probiotic results in animal studies in suppressing those proteins along with Parkinson's symptoms. Anyway. I think that's all we've got for now. I mean, I think we could go on for another 30 or 40 minutes, honestly, but Doctor, would you like to share any parting words?
Well, again, I'm delighted that this subject has promoted, it seems, a lot of sharing of information among members of the PD-active community. And that's fantastic. I mean, that's the best we can hope for at this point until the science, picks up momentum. And I think that will happen with the greater legal availability. There will be a push to get more good controlled scientific studies of all of these things, but don't hold your breath on it. It's going to take years, for all of that. And you're wanting to kind of experience what kind of benefits, if any, you might be able to attain right now, not years from now, after we have some big double-blind placebo-controlled study of something. So I'm delighted that your invitation to me and my being here this morning has promoted this degree of exchange of information. And I'm looking forward to staying in contact with you, Todd, and others around what you do compile from all of this, whether there's any way I could be helpful at any point in providing more information or reviewing something or something like that. But I don't, and I will follow up on getting advice from my friends around cannabis prescribers,
yes,
or physicians that might, or nurse practitioners that might be knowledgeable about this. But I don't have any commercial connections or interest myself in any of these things. So I'm not promoting any particular thing, but I want to be helpful in whatever ways that I can.
Right. Well, good. And yes, I think staying in touch would be important. I think next steps for us are to definitely try to, like you, I'm very impressed with how responsive folks are being in this particular exchange, how much curiosity there is out there, how much experience there is. And we need to start to blend the two so that our experience can be coalesced into a an ersatz database, if you will, to answer the questions that others have. But I think we'll try a survey to start that process working. But thank you very much for being sort of a vehicle of engagement for us, and giving us some of your great experience and studies. It's been very helpful. I thank you very much, Dr. Presti, for being with us today.
Thank you.
You're welcome, Mary. You're welcome, Todd. Thank you for the invitation. Thanks to all of you, and best wishes for good continued exploration of this and being able to benefit in whatever ways are possible for each of you to get healing and relief from symptoms. That this, it's been an honor to be here, and again, I support greatly what you're doing as a PD Active community. Nice.
And as a parting shot, I will tell you that the chat board is now filling up with thank yous to you. So
thank you
Doctor,
all.
Thank you for a great presentation. Thank you for speaking today, et cetera, et cetera. So, but do allow me my last two parting shots, and shameless plug on our other PD Active movement classes. Please keep your eyes open for those in the PD Active community. Emails go out pretty regularly. If you have not tried any of them, I strongly recommend them. And like I said, we are hoping to grow those classes so that we can continue to keep our instructors engaged. And finally, we would love to see contributions for this particular event come in through the link that I posted earlier in the conversation and in the chat window. We need to keep funding these things. We miss seeing all of our PD Active community in person, but we're trying to do the best we can with the circumstances we're up against. Please, everyone, stay safe, stay active, and try to stay socially engaged, and have a great rest of your weekend. Thank you, Dr. Presti.
You're welcome. Thank you. Best wishes to all of you.
Thanks. Bye, everyone. Have a great weekend.